Oh, wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. How you guys doing today on this Wednesday? Thank you for making the time to be here. Appreciate you guys, especially everybody in the live chat. Wow, wow. Hey, so you guys know I have a lot of new subscribers, a lot of new people watching that ask me a lot of questions a lot of the times, and I think it's time to revisit Anthony Johnson and the story of Anthony Johnson and John Casor. Who is Anthony Johnson? What did he do? Who he was? What did he cause another man, his status to be? We're gonna go over that again today. A lot of new subscribers, not going back to my older videos, guys. So we compiled the research we've done on Anthony Johnson here for today. We're gonna revisit this again. Hope you guys enjoy it. Welcome. Appreciate you guys being here. Thank you once again. Much love. Smart. Let me go ahead and get the video ready right here. All right. Appreciate you guys tuning in, being here on time. Make sure to like and share the video so we can get more traffic. Appreciate you guys. Much love, much love. Here we go. G Kingdom of Akamaki, or the Eastern Shore of Virginia, in the 17th century, by Jennings Cropper Wise, member of the Virginia Historical Society. This is from 1911. Chapter 15 says here, the Negro and the slave. It is generally accepted fact that the Dutch were responsible for the introduction of slaves into Virginia in 1619. All right, again, my famous phrase, drop nation. Dodged the hijack. Big time, right? First of all, it wasn't Dutch, it was just a Dutch ship. It was English privateers or pirates, right? That brought some people that they had taken from a Spanish ship off the coast of Veracruz, Mexico. That ship was coming from Lisbon, Portugal. It wasn't coming from Africa. And they came in as indentured servants, they with a contract, and who eventually they got their freedom. So it's not what you're thinking about what they're trying to tell you here. The first slaves, all right, dodged the hijack big time. It was several years later before the first Negro appeared on the Eastern Shore. Again, dodged the hijack again. I'm keep telling you. What you mean? Again, you've been here for years, since creation. What you mean, first Negro? Copper-colored tribes of America. And a decade had elapsed before slaves were brought to the peninsula. All right, you see that? There was no slaves until a decade later. The first Negroes in Accomac, of whom we have any knowledge, were two free citizens of color, Anthony Johnson and his wife Mary. They were so highly thought of by the white inhabitants of the country. White, remember, white, what does free white mean? So they were highly thought of, right? They weren't meaning nobody thought of them as slaves or anything like that, all right, or foreigners. It was just like them. That when in 1652 they had the misfortune to lose by fire after great service and etc. After dwelling as law-abiding citizens in the country for over 30 years, they were exempted from paying taxes. That's how good they got treated. Supposedly, they had lost a lot of their property or something happened where they lost a lot in the fire. While no Negroes are mentioned in the census of 1623, what do you mean no Negroes? I bet you a lot of the people that are in that census are so-called Negroes, Sephardic and Moorish people. We've already gone over this. I check out my videos, the not-so-English colony of Jamestown and Roanoke, okay? The Johnsons must have lived there at that time. So he even estimated it, even though there's no Negroes mentioned in the census, because they weren't calling people by Negro or white back then. Still, the Johnsons were in that list, and they didn't call them Negroes. The descendants of these free Negroes were, for many years, respected property owners and owned, in addition to much land, a number of slaves. They owned what? Slaves who? These colored people, free citizens of color, huh? Free citizens of color. They owned what? Slaves, a number of slaves. In 1654, 100 acres of land lying along the Pongotee Creek were granted to Richard Johnson, the son of Anthony, the former being a carpenter by trade and a skilled mechanic. This tract was contiguous to the estate of John Johnson, also a Negro, and that of Anthony Johnson. So these are the offspring of Anthony and Mary. These are the children and grandchildren. Later, a dispute, and we got the tree done. We got the genealogical tree done, so I'm going to show you guys. Later, a dispute arose as to the title to the land, and we find the following entry. Whereas John Johnson, Negro, has this day made complaint in court that John Johnson, Sr., detaineth a patent for 450 acres, which John Johnson, Jr. claims. So he's going up against his dad. Listen to this. John Johnson, Sr. is ordered to appear in court. Anthony Johnson entered suit soon after. This for the purpose of recovering his Negro servant who had been appropriated by Robert Parker. This is Anthony Johnson trying to get John Casor back. Remember, he sued Robert Parker, who had him, and then the court ruled in favor of Anthony Johnson, making John Casor his servant for life. Okay, this is what they're referencing, okay, in this book right here, Historical Virginia. It's called The Free Negro Heads of Families in the United States in 1830, together with A Brief Treatment of the Free Negro by Carter G. Woodson, PhD. This is right in the beginning. In the foreword, it says here, on the second paragraph, says the aim of this report, like that on free Negro owners of slaves in the United States in 1830, we have that book too, we're going to get into that one, is to promote the further study of a neglected aspect of our history. As stated elsewhere, most of these free Negroes have been forgotten, all right? So-called free Negroes, all right? For persons supposedly well informed in history are surprised to learn today that about a half a million, almost 1/7 of the Negroes of this country, you heard that, were free. They were free prior to the emancipation in 1865. Who was really getting freed in that time? Because half a million or a seventh of the so-called Negroes were already free in 1865. All right, they're letting you know here. It is hardly believed that a considerable number of Negroes were owners of the slaves themselves, and in some cases controlled large plantations. All right, they're letting you know straight up. The drop right here. See, you got the whole thing confused. How they told you, Kunta Kinte. They told you roots. They told you Africans coming and you working in chains all your life. Everybody. Until 1865. From 1619 to 1865, they told you, right? But that's a fantasy. That's a fairy tale. That's fictional writing. Plagiarized fictional writing. The truth is, there was free people here, free so-called Negroes, that were never, ever slaves or indentured servants. And they had land, and they had actual indentured servants themselves, so-called slaves. They're letting you know here. They control large plantations. It wasn't just white people, all right? So-called whites. We're going to see, all right? We already know white Europeans came as indentured servants too, right? So who's really getting emancipation in 1865?
Now, we're in the Smithsonian Magazine. It says here, the horrible fate of John Casor, the first black man to be declared slave for life in America. You thought they were all already slaves for life. That's what you thought, right? Actually, this was the first person that was legally, officially put in perpetual servitude and treated as chattel. It says here, black people in early America weren't slaves. After this lawsuit, they could be. You understand what's going on here? Smithsonian Magazines. Again, this ain't me. It says, black people in early America weren't slaves, but after this lawsuit, they could be. It says, the only day definitely connected to John Casor's life is this day in 1654, 1655. Look at the times. All right, 1650s. It's not when he was born, when he achieved something, or when he died. It's when he became a slave. Casor was originally in what? An indentured servant. These weren't slaves. Remember, these times everybody was an indentured servant. Contract, which meant he was practically a slave in some senses, but what was bought or sold wasn't him. It was his contract of indenture. You hear? It wasn't your person. It wasn't your body. It was your service. It was your work that they wanted, your labor. Your contract of indenture, which obligated him to work for its holder for the period of it said. At the end of that time, indentured servants who could be of any race were considered legally free and sent out into the world. Continuing says, this might sound like a rough deal, but indenture was how the British colonizers who lived in what will later become the United States managed to populate the land and get enough people to do the backbreaking work of farming crops like tobacco in the South. Hold up, Smithsonian Magazine. Are you telling me it's not Africans that the British used to populate the land and get enough people to do backbreaking work to farm the crops like tobacco in the South? So what's the deal? Now they're telling us it's it's British indentured servants they had. Where were they getting these indentured servants, these British, right? We already know the story. Convicts, undesirables, Indians, not Africans. They ain't going to Africa to get indentured servants. That wasn't part of the venture of Virginia Company. People who survived their period of indenture, many didn't, went on to live free lives in the colonies. All right, they got freedom, often after receiving some kind of small compensation like clothes, land, or tools to help set them up. Again, land, 50 acres. That was the incentive that caused many poor whites, and now they want to say the poor whites, to indenture themselves and their families and move to the so-called New World. It wasn't just so-called whites. That's the hijack. You gotta dodge it, right? We're gonna break the spell. We're gonna break these many layers. We're gonna uncover all these layers. You gotta follow me, right? You gotta go back to the other videos if you're new, right? There was also people of dark complexion, people of color who were what you call black Britons, black Irish, black Scots, black Germans, black Swedish, black Portuguese, black Spaniards being indentured over here too. Wasn't just white poor people. All right, so that's the hijack on that. But they letting you know here, slavery didn't exist how you were told, right? But Africans who were indentured were often captured and brought over against their will. So now they're adding their hijack because they gotta add that, you know, because they know so-called Negroes were indentured too. They weren't slaves, so now they gotta try to figure out where they came from, right? So they gotta go with the hijack, right? No genealogy is leading back to Africa. In fact, genealogy is actually correlating with what we're studying. Didn't these poor whites also get brought here against their will? See, this is what I'm saying. See how they're throwing the hijack in a little bit. They want to act like they came here on their own. No, a lot of these people were what? Spirited away, kidnapped, right? Convicts. This was a penal what? A penal colony. They were dumping convicts over here against their will. That's what happened to the holders of Casor's indenture. Anthony Johnson, all right? Anthony Johnson, right? It says Johnson served out his contract and went on to run his own tobacco farm and hold his own indentured servants, among them Casor. You understand what's going on here? This is a person of color. Anthony Johnson was what you call a so-called Negro, all right? He wasn't an African. There's no proof of him being African in any way. So Anthony Johnson was an indentured servant. He wasn't a slave. He got his freedom. After he did his contract, his work, he provided his service, he got his freedom. And what did he do? He got his own land. He got his own indentured servants slash slaves. And he had Casor as one of his servants. At this time, the colony of Virginia had very few black people in it. Johnson was one of the original 20. Dodge the hijack. Because you've been here since creation. You're the American Indians. What do you mean there's no black people in Virginia? You understand how big the hijack is in that statement they're making right there? That's a very bold statement, Smithsonian Magazine. They can never prove that right, and we can definitely prove them wrong. We know that. And the colony of Virginia, again, we already know, we just read, right, the invention of the white race, that white race that had no power. It didn't exist. It wasn't even in records till 60 years after 1619. And this whole time, Anthony Johnson existed, and that's why I came over to read this. Anthony Johnson's time, that word white never existed in records. It was just Englishmen and European. Christians, remember, Christians. That included both complexions, dark and light, dark and pale. After a disagreement about whether or not Casor's contract was lapsed, a court ruled in favor of Johnson, and Casor saw the status of his indenture turn into slavery. Where he not his contract was considered property, Casor claimed that he had served his indenture of 7 or 8 years, and 7 more years on top of that. He even did 14. I mean, he did double. The court sided with Johnson, who claimed that Casor was his slave for life, his slave for life. We're talking about two so-called Negroes battling it out. We're talking about somebody, a supposed slave, right, going to court in the 1650s. You think you know history? Because we're talking about 1650s here. And people of color, what you call it, so-called African American today, going to court, fighting for their freedom, enslaving other so-called people of color, and making them become their property for life. This was the first official slave. Now you want to talk about first slaves that came? No, this is the first slave, first chattel property because of another so-called Negro. It was a black man, right? So-called black man that owned another so-called black man. That's the official first slave for life.
Okay.
The illegal beginning of American Negro slavery. Again, the illegal beginning of American Negro slavery. And continuing, it says, a Negro plaintiff wins a precedent for slavery. Finally, this period of equivocal judicial recognition was climaxed with the ironic case of Johnson versus Parker. in the Northampton County Court in Virginia, 1653. Anthony Johnson was the first free Negro, dodge the hijack, in North America and the first Negro landowner. Again, dodge the hijack. He was also one of the first substantial holders of indentured servants and later of slaves. In 1653, one of Johnson's Negro servants, named Casor, complained that his 7-year term of indenture had expired, but that Johnson continued to hold him in service illegally. One Robert Parker demanded that Johnson release Casor, amid threats that he, Parker, would testify for Casor in court that Johnson held him illegally, resulting under local law in a possible forfeiture of lands by Johnson. Under this duress, Johnson freed Casor, who promptly bound himself to Parker for 7 years. So this dude Parker helped Casor, but then he said, alright, but now you gotta serve me for 7 years. You see how slick they were, right? Realizing that he had been duped, Johnson sued Parker to repossess Casor. The court ruled for Johnson, of course, declaring that Parker was illegally detaining Casor from his rightful master, who legally held Casor for the duration of his life. You hear this? This is the first case on record of a judicial determination of Negro servitude for life, a precedent set by a Negro as plaintiff. So you see what you're hearing. You hear this, people. Basically, this was the first person that was deemed an official slave for life, and it was through the help of another Negro. Okay?
Right now we're in this book. It's called The Free Negro in Virginia, 1619 to 1865 by John H. Russell. We're going to read on chapter 2 of this book, The Origin of the Free Negro Class. And it says here, were any or all of these Negroes permitted to realize the freedom to which servants were entitled under the laws and customs of servitude? In the records of the county courts dating from 1632 to 1661, Negroes are designated as servants, Negro servants, or simply as Negroes, but never in the records, again, listen to this, never in the records which we have examined were they termed slaves. All right, they were never called slaves. By an order of the General Court, a Negro brought from the West Indies to Virginia in 1625 was declared to belong to Sir Francis Wyatt, the governor, as his servant, not a slave. There is nothing in the record which indicate that servant meant the same as slave. Again, there is nothing. Stop adding stuff. Stop adding the African stories. This ain't Kunta Kinte movies. Stop adding that. There is nothing in the record which indicates that servant meant the same as slave. Among the 23 African servants, all right, dodge the hijack, what African servants? Enumerated in 1624 was a Negro man named Anthony, all right? Dodge the hijack. We already know Anthony, all right? We're going to show you again. Anthony was coming from England. Coming from England, it's conjecture to say he was African, okay? And a Negro woman named Mary, who was also coming from England, serving under different masters. In the county court records of Northampton of date February 28, 1652 is the following order. Upon G. Humble petition of Anthony Johnson, Negro, and Mary, his wife, and their information to G. Court, that they have been inhabitants in Virginia above 30 years, consideration being taken of their hard labor and honored service performed by the petitioners of this county for G. obtaining of their livelihood, and G. great loss they have sustained by an unfortunate fire with their present charge to provide for. All right, they had a fire. Be it therefore fit and order that from the day of the day hereof, during their natural life, the said Mary Johnson and 2 daughters of Anthony Johnson, Negro, be disengaged and freed upon payment of taxes and levies in Northampton County for public use. Subtracting 30 or more years from 1652, the date of this court order, we find that Anthony Johnson and possibly the woman who became his wife were inhabitants of Virginia before 1622. If additional evidence is required to establish the fact that Anthony Johnson and his family were free in 1652, It is contained in a land patent of 1651, assigning him to a fee simple 250 acres of land, or in the records of a suit which he maintained in the county court in 1655. Just what part of the period of over 30 years of Anthony Johnson's residence in the colony was a term of servitude, or how long before 1652 he had enjoyed his freedom, is not clear, okay? They don't know when he was freed from his indenture. This Anthony Johnson who came as a servant, right? Whether it was 4 to 7 years, which one was it? They don't know. Could have been 4. He could have only worked for 1 or 2, 3 years, maybe a little longer. But by 1651 and 52, he was free. The term of service for white servants was not uniform either, right? So they didn't have a set date either. So-called white servants, right? Free white, being dependent upon the conditions of the contract, an indenture.
All right, so now we're in the Journal of Negro History by Carter G. Woodson, Volume 1. This is from 1916. And we go all the way to page 233 of this book, which is Volume 1, Number 3. It says colored freemen as slave owners in Virginia. All right, colored what? Freemen, slave owners. With no evidence beyond this explicit admission in the written law of the right of free Negroes to own servants and slaves of their own race, it could scarcely be doubted that there were in the colony colored men known to the framers of this law who held to service persons of their own race and color. But when the court records are open and the strange story of the free Negro, Anthony Johnson's strange story, it's a strange story. You get it? It's a strange story. They're going to tell you it's a strange story. That's the hijack. This is so strange. What do you mean a black man owned another black man? What do you mean he made him become a slave for life? What are you talking about, Kurimeo? That's a strange story. Just like this journal saying, Anthony Johnson and his slave John Casor is read and understood. We are forced to a realization of the impartial attitude of the law toward black masters, not only in its outward expression, but also in its actual application. The story of relation of these two black settlers in the young colony is worth relating in the quaint language of the times, word for word, as it appears in the manuscript records. It says here, the deposition of Captain Sam Goldsmith, taken in open court, 8th March 1654, saith that being at G house of Anthony Johnson, Negro, about the beginning of November. Remember, Anthony Johnson is a Negro, right? In the beginning of November, last to receive a host of tobacco, a Negro called John Casor came to his deponent, told him yet he came into Virginia for 7 or 8 years of indenture, yet he had demanded his freedom of Anthony Johnson. His master further said he had kept him servant 7 years longer than he should or ought, and desired that his deponent would see he might have no wrong, whereupon your deponent demanded of Anthony Johnson his indenture. All right, so they're saying he's complaining. John Casor's going to this dude saying, yo, man, he held me. He already worked for 7 years, and he held me on top of that another 7 years, and I need you to help me with my indenture. I guess he's trying to give his indenture to him. It says, Anthony Johnson said he had G. Negro for his life. But Mr. Robert George Parker said they knew that G said Negro had an indenture in one Mr. Sandy's hand on G other side of G Bain. Further said Mr. Robert Parker and his brother George, if the said Anthony Johnson did not let go of Negro go free, he said Negro John Casor would recover most of his cows from him, G said Johnson. Then Anthony Johnson, and this did suppose was in a great fears. Anthony Johnson's son-in-law, his wife, and his own 2 sons persuaded the old Negro Anthony Johnson to set the said John Casor free. All right, so that was when he set him free, and then he went to court, right? He went to court, and he got him back for life. It says John Casor was not, however, permitted to enjoy long his freedom. Johnson decided to petition the county court to determine whether John Casor was a slave for life or a servant for 7 years of indenture. The court record of the suit is as follows. All right, it says, whereas complaint was this day made to G Court by G humble petition of Anthony Johnson, the Negro, Mr. Robert Parker, that he detaineth one John Casor, another Negro, right? Another a Negro on a Negro. We're talking about a court case, 1650s people, all right? The plaintiff's servant under pretense, yet the said Casor is a free man. The court seriously considering a maturely weighing G premises do find that G said Mr. Robert Parker most unrightly keepeth said Negro John Casor from his right master Anthony Johnson, as it appears by the deposition of Captain Small Goldsmith in many probable circumstances. Be it therefore G judgment of G court in order that G said John Casor Negro shall forthwith be turned into G service of his said master Anthony Johnson, and that the said Mr. Robert Parker make payment of all charges in the suit and execution. So they returned John Casor over to Johnson. The court returned it to him. And it says, and thus sustaining the claim of Anthony Johnson to perpetual service of John Casor, the court gave judicial sanction to the right of Negroes to own slaves of their own race. Indeed, no earlier record to our knowledge has been found of judicial support given to slavery in Virginia. To judicial support, no earlier records. It didn't exist anywhere. So there was no records, right, of any judicial support for chattel slavery before that. In Virginia, do you understand that? 1650s, it didn't exist. And additional gleanings from the record show that this black slave master, again, this black slave master was a respected citizen of wealth. He had money. He was a very wealthy black slave master and one of the very earliest Negro arrivals upon this continent, if indeed he was not one of the first 20 brought in the Dutch man of war in 1619. You see that? Every doubt of the correctness of this assertion should be banished by perusal of the somewhat detailed evidence upon which the conclusion is based. The discovery of the fact that Anthony Johnson was a slave owner led to a further examination of court records and land patents for additional information concerning him. In the court records of Northampton County in 1653, it was found recorded that Anthony Johnson, Negro, has this day made his complaint to G Court that John Johnson, Sr., most unrightly detained a patent of his for 450 acres of land, which patent John Johnson, Negro, claimeth and boldly affirmeth to be his land. You see, he went to court with another, so-called Negro, another John Johnson. All right? They're fighting with some land. A search in the early land patents of the state revealed a grant by the authorities of the state of 250 acres of land in Northampton County to Anthony Johnson, a Negro. The grant was made as head rights. Remember what a head right was. This was how they received indentured servants, and every indentured servant they got 50 lands. The colony gave the person 50 acres for every indentured servant the person had or brought over from Europe. All right, so the head right system in the colony. Still, upon the importation by the Negro of 5 persons in the colony. So again, the grant was made as head rights upon the importation by the Negro of 5 persons into the colony. So he got 5 people, right? So that would be 250 acres, 50 acres for each. Still pursuing the record of this black freeman who was able to maintain a slave, the following was discovered in the records of the County Court of Northampton. So they're finding all kinds of stuff when they study Anthony Johnson's history.
All right, now we're going to read from this book, Slavery in the United States, a social, political, and historical encyclopedia. All right, Slavery in the United States by Junius P. Rodriguez. This is volume 1. This year in 1654, in Northampton County, Virginia, Anthony Johnson, himself a free black, filed suit in court to make his black indentured servant, John Casor, a servant for life. This is the first recorded case in Virginia civil court where an indentured servant was effectively transformed into a slave, or chattel, right, for life. But before 1654, down here it says in 1651, in Northampton, Virginia, Anthony Johnson, the same guy, right, a free black man, imported 5 servants. Did that include John Casor? How did these 5 servants? Maybe. and again imported from where? Most likely Europe, which entitled him to receive a 200-acre land grant along the Pulgotique River. Johnson and a group of other free blacks attempted to establish an independent black community. At one point, the community contained 12 homesteads. All right, do you hear what they're saying here? He's not the only free black. Remember they were saying he was the only free black, the Johnsons? There was numerous independent black families there, independent black communities. They were trying to establish 12 homestead. It says here, black slave owners. Slavery in the United States has traditionally been portrayed as an institution that was based on race. Generally speaking, this conviction is correct, but its propagation has led to the almost universal belief that all slave owners were white and that all slaves were of African descent. Again, it's not true, right? They're letting you know that's not true. That's not true. That's a false story. In reality, although there were no white slaves, dodge the hijack, we have a whole series, White Servitude, right? European indentured servants included so-called pale or fair-skinned people and Negroes. There were black slave owners from the colonial period to the Civil War. They were what? Black slave owners, not just in the 1800s when they were getting their freedom. No, since the colonial period, since they were colonizing, right? 1600s to the Civil War, there was black slave owners. Census records, deeds of sale, wills of free blacks providing for the disposition of slaves, and records of freedom suits bought by slaves against free blacks attest that there were numerous black masters in the United States. Numerous black masters. Name. What slave master surname? Black masters in the United States. Black slave owners, as did white owners, obtained slaves by inheritance, gifts, and purchase. Same thing. Records identify Anthony Johnson as perhaps the earliest black slave owner. For Johnson, a former slave himself, acquired John Casor, a slave in the 1650s. A local court sanctioned the right of free blacks to own slaves when it ruled not to give Casor his freedom when he sued Johnson for it.
Virginia Commonwealth University, emancipators, protectors, and anomalies, free black slave owners in Virginia. An anomaly because you're a black person who's a master, so they have to try to write this somehow as an anomaly because they're finding this in the record. On page 321, it says, free black slave ownership was less complicated when it began in the 1650s. When it began in the 1650s, black slave owners in the 1650s. So what are you talking about? African slavery and blacks have been oppressed, and there was people who actually oppressed their own people. So it wasn't about a complexion thing, is what I'm trying to show you here, all right? Free black ownership was less complicated when it began in the 1650s, but when it threatened to grow, legislators took quick action to limit it. More famous than either Archibald Batty or Pharaoh Shepherd was Anthony Johnson of the Eastern Shore, one of the earliest so-called Afro-Americans to own any kind of bondsman in Virginia. Indeed, in 1655, Johnson successfully petitioned for judicial reversal of a court-ordered emancipation of his servant 1 year earlier. But Johnson would be one of the last of his people in Virginia to next turn to have and hold another human in servitude. Yeah, sure. So again, Anthony first so-called person to hold somebody in perpetual servitude, chattel, as chattel property for life. A black man on another so-called black man. John Casor, look at the case. About, why I wanted to
who tried to illegally take
Anthony
Johnson for the importation of 11 persons, including Mary Johnson. He received this. That's what I'm saying.
Anthony Johnson, he was an indentured servant. He eventually got his freedom after he did his contract, his time that he was bound. And he eventually had a lot of acres. We just read, thanks to Open Mija, he found that Free Negro Johnson family record. And it actually matched with what I had read before about Anthony Johnson suing to get his slave back. So imagine a Negro suing to get another Negro back for life, making his indentured for life.
And real quick in Wikipedia, Anthony Johnson, it says colonist, right? It don't say slave.
He's a colonist. It says was a black Angolan dodged a hijack. There's no proof of that. He's known for achieving freedom and wealth in the early 17th century colony of Virginia. All right, he was one of the first African American dodged a hijack property owners and had his right to legally own a slave recognized by the Virginia courts. Held as an indentured servant in 1621, he earned his freedom after several years and was granted land by the colony. He was an indentured servant. He later became a successful tobacco farmer in Maryland. He was a plantation owner. He attained great wealth after completing his term as an indentured servant, and he has been referred to as the Black Patriarch of the first community of Negro property owners in America. Oh, really? He's the black, so-called black power, right? Black patriarch. He had slaves. Now look at this. Early life in the early 1620s, slave traders captured him in Angola, it says. That's no proof of that. All right? And gave him the name Antonio and brought him to the Americas where he was sold to colonists in Virginia. Now look at this. There's no quote for this one. This line, there's no quote, right? Now it says, and the next line says, as an indentured servant, Antonio worked for a merchant at the Virginia Company. Now we have quotes for that, right? Because that is history, not the Angolan part. That's the hijack they throw in there. I've already shown the research. He sailed to Virginia in 1621 aboard the James. See? Now he sailed to Virginia aboard the James. Where was the James coming from? The Virginia Muster Census of 1624 lists his name as Antonio, not given recorded as a Negro in the notes column. All right, we just got that. Historians have some dispute as to whether this was the Antonio later known as Anthony Johnson. As the census lists several Antonios, this one is considered the most likely. So now they're making up a whole Angola thing and they're trying to link it up because these people are not supposed to exist. They're not supposed to be black people owners, plantation owners, or free or indentured servants. They never taught you about indentured servitude. They wanted you to think Kunta Kinte. That's all they wanted you to think. All right? Johnson was sold as an indentured servant, though. That's quoted. That we can research that. To a white planter named Bennett to work on his Virginia tobacco farm. Slave laws were not passed until 1661 in Virginia. All right? He wasn't a slave because it wasn't even there. It didn't even exist until 1661, really. Prior to that date, says hijack Africans, so-called Africans, right? People of color were not officially considered to be slaves. People of color were not officially considered to be slaves. All right, we got many quotes here. And this is where it brings us. We've read this indentured service in the US, right? Indentured service, and it talks about white Europeans. We've read this in the last video. All right, go get it, PBS. This is history. Such workers typically worked under a limited indentured contract for 4 to 7 years to pay off their passage, room, board, lodging, and freedom dues in the early colonial years. Most Africans in the 13 colonies were held under such contracts of limited indentured servitude. With the exception of those indentured for life, they were released after a contracted period, with many of the indentured receiving land equipment after their contracts expired or were bought out. Most white laborers in this period also came to the colony as indentured servants. Again, most white laborers, all of them, all the white laborers that came were indentured servants too. Let's not forget about the white ones, okay? They're letting you know. Antonio almost lost his life in an Indian massacre, it says in 1622, when his master's plantation was attacked. The Powhatan, who were the Native Americans dominant in the Tidewater, Virginia, were trying to evict the colonists from their lands. The Powhatan was like, yo, you guys are in our lands, get out of here. They attacked the settlement where Johnson worked on Good Friday and killed 52 of 57 men. The following year, 1623, Mary, listen to this, a Negro arrived from where? From England. Remember, from what ship? Aboard the Margaret and John. This is historic. You can research that. A Negro from England. A Negro from England. Again, marry a Negro from England. Again, marry a Negro from England, not Africa. That was his wife eventually. All right. She was brought to work on the same plantation as Antonio, where she was the only woman. It says Antonio married and lived together for more than 40 years.
All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and verify that information we read on Wikipedia, you know, general information. But again, a lot of the info is correct there. We just gotta go look for the sources. Now, this is the book. It's the original list of persons of quality, immigrants, religious exiles, political rebels, servant men sold for a term of years, apprentices, children stolen, maidens pressed, and others who went from Great Britain to the American plantations. All right, This could be Anthony. Antonio could have been one, and Mary could have been. These are abducted people, undesirables that were in England, not necessarily African. I'm going to prove to you Anthony, the first black slaver, all right, in the USA, was from England. Nowhere does it say that he was coming in from Africa as a slave. He was an indentured servant coming in from England. This is from the 1600s to 1700s list with their ages, the localities where they formerly lived in the mother country, the names of the ships in which they embarked, and other interesting particulars. Okay, from John Camden Houghton. This is from 1874. So I go to page 241 of this book, and it says here, the muster of the inhabitants of Waris Kojak, taken 7th of February 1624. The muster of Mr. Edward Bennett's servants. Again, whose servants? We just read in Wikipedia, right? It says here, Johnson was sold as an indentured servant to a white planter named Bennett. Was he really white, so-called white? Remember what free white meant? I'm going to prove to you what Bennett means, who this Bennett is. So again, the muster of Edward Bennett's servants, okay? He came under James, right? So it says these are all his servants. He had some that came in on the ship, the London Merchant, one of the Adam, the James, John and Francis, the Guifty, and the Margaret and John. Now, pay close attention. What does it say here? Antonio, a Negro. Anthony, right? He had a Anthony Johnson. Antonio, the Negro, right? Mary, and Mary, his wife, from the Margaret and John. This is historic. 2 years later, a year later after him, I believe, she came in on the Margaret and John. Again, this was coming from England. All right, and where were they living? Waris Kojak. Waris Koki, Warwick Squeak was officially formed in 1634 in the Virginia colony, but had already been known as Waris Kojak County before this. It was named for an Algonquin-speaking tribe that was part of the Powhatan Confederacy. The county was renamed in 1637 as Isle of Wight County. Isle of Wight County. You got a lot of ancestors going back there when you do your genealogy. Now you know the original name of that place, and it's a Powhatan, if anything. Any indigenous people there, Algonquin-speaking Powhatan Indians, after the island in the English Channel, all right? So they named it after there. Now down here it says on the history, and it starts talking about who was first there. Right here it says the first English plantation in the region dating to 1618 was that of a Puritan merchant. Puritan, who's the Puritan? Christopher Lawn, all right? You're just telling me that's a white man? Merchants, who's the so-called merchants? And a Puritan, a lot of them were crypto Jews, crypto Moors. A lot of the Puritans were Moors, right? They were being persecuted by the Catholics. So they came to America for religious freedom. Several other Puritans also settled nearby. Who also is a Puritan? Edward Bennett. Again, who was Edward Bennett? The one who employed Antonio the Negro, who's coming from England, all right? Again, Johnson worked for a white planter, so-called white. Nah, he's Bennett. Bennett is a Puritan, an English merchant, right? Another merchant. Who's the merchant, huh? And a free member of the London Company. The London Company was among those who got land patent and founded his plantation in 1621. He named this plantation Warasquoki, after the river which the indigenous people called by that name. He used their own name and claimed and made his plantation, where he brought Anthony Johnson. His plantation suffered high fatalities of colonists in the Great Massacre of 1622, losing 53 persons. A total of 347 colonists were killed that day, as the Powhatan tribe tried to kill and expel the English. So again, this is a primary source. This is muster rolls from the 1600s listing Antonio coming from England to work under Edward Bennett. That's history. That is history. He eventually got his freedom and got his own land and his own slaves. Do you understand what you're seeing right now? He did not come from Africa, dodge the hijack without all that Angola talk. He was not one of those first 16, 19 Negroes. A lot of scholars and historians try to say, or hint that he might be one of the 16, 19, 20 odd Negroes that came in from the Caribbean, that were stolen from the Caribbean, right? But he was actually listed here, Antonio a Negro, under Edward Bennett. That's where he ended up. It has to be him. Logically, we're not going to start adding and conjectures and all this other stuff to this. He's coming from England. We're not going to do what Jabari did with Guinea Jim, right? And saying that, hey, oh, he was a Scotsman, but he was originally from Africa, but there's no history of that. We're not going to make all that stuff up, right? Antonio a Negro was coming from England. He came on the James. He came on the James, in the James, all right? In the James ship, 1621, and his wife came on the Margaret and John, 1622. They both went to work in the Isle of Wight, or the Wadis Kojak plantation of Edward Bennett, before they gained their freedom and became the prominent Johnson Negroes, right, that owned land. All right. So real quick, just to refresh our memories, again, we got to remember what we've learned in the past videos. We got to stop believing or thinking that all Europeans that came were pale-skinned people, that all your names were slave master names and all that. We've gone over the information in this book, Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America, a genealogical history. Remember, we read the whole chapter 3, Virginia, first, and not so English colony. What they mean is that a lot of these people had Sephardic, Moorish surnames, and it didn't seem like they were just, your typical so-called Christian English, pale-skinned Christian English, all right? Now, in part of this book, it says here, as before, the ship stopped first at the Canary Islands, a land with a large converso Morisco population. All right, that was from chapter 2, which we broke down as well. Upon reaching the North American mainland near Cape Fear, the ship's log discusses Captain Aubrey and Captain Bonington, Sephardic surnames, a trading family later active in Jamaica. The list of colonists left to settle at Roanoke is given in Appendix C in the original spelling of the time, with a bit of decipherment. The pattern seems clear. Can names such as John Gostigo, Antoine Rouse or Rousset, Thomas Parry, Joseph Borges, Spanish surname, and Bennett Baruch Chapel, not to mention Dugan Gans, our friend Joaquim Gans, be those of typical Britons? Obviously not. Bennett, remember, that's Anthony Johnson's supposed owner, right? He was a Puritan, he was a merchant. We already got too many hints to know this most likely is a colored person, crypto Jew, crypto Moor. Just real quick, we're here in the book of Jewish and crypto Jewish surnames, okay? Crypto Jewish surnames. So down here, just correlating again, it says Bass eventually moved to Virginia himself, as did Edward Bennett, Baruch Blesson, a well-established London merchant. Baruch Bennett is the same. It says Bennett belonged to the large group of Jewish surnames based on the biblical Baruch, blessed in Hebrew. Here we're in the web.archive.org with an article that's been archived here regarding the Waroskoki Koyaki plantation of Edward Bennett. Just want to go. It says here, chief among the Puritans, Puritan cryptos, who were among the first to settle the Isle of Wight County, was Edward Bennett, former elder of the ancient church of Amsterdam, who was in Amsterdam, remember, son of Robert Bennett, a tanner of Welpscombe, Somerset. He was christened in the parish church of Welpscombe in 1577-78, being the 15th and last child in the family. Bennett married into the Bourne family of Somerset and is often described in the records as being a wealthy London merchant. We already know those were the Sephardic Moorish people who were the wealthy London merchants. Edward Bennett fled to Holland during the Puritan migrations and became, by his wealth, a principal pillar of the ancient church. All right. Edward Bennett had a hand in settling over 600 people in the Isle of Wight County. Bennett and his associates Richard Wiseman and Thomas Wiseman were members of the Virginia Company. In addition to his position as wealthy London merchant, Edward Bennett was the owner of a large fleet of ships which traded with Virginia. Right, so he had all these ships, he had money. Again, Sephardic Jew. Who had the ships? He was also Commissioner of Virginia at the Court of England. He came to Virginia at times, but apparently did not become a resident, leaving the management of his lands to his nephews Richard and Robert. Edward Bennett also had two brothers to die in Virginia, Robert and Richard. The brothers and nephews are often confused. When Edward Bennett returned to England shortly after 1628, his nephew Richard became the leader of the Puritans in Virginia. Richard Bennett and the Puritan colony moved to Nassau, which was largely populated by Puritans. All right, so there was Puritans or cryptos all over the place, not just in New England. You know, Pilgrims and Puritans weren't just in New England. Okay. All right, so again, just wanted to give a little history of Edward Bennett, the employer or so-called master of Antonio. All right, Antonio or Anthony Johnson, who was coming from England. It was a Sephardic Jew. He was also a colored man. So you see, it didn't start with Anthony. So dodge the hijack, and that's one of the main things I want you to remember. All these people around this time were colored people, mostly, and the Indians. Everybody's colored, so it's not about complexion during this time. All right, so just real quick, just to correlate here, a little bit of info, general info on the James, the ship that Antonio was on. The ship James made several trips during the early 17th century Great Migration out of England, not Africa, and never went to Angola, to the New World. It is unclear how many ships were named James during the Great Migration, as the name James was very popular in England during the reign of James I. It appears that James landed right around the New Year because some of the passengers reported as landed in 1621 and others in 1622, most likely due to winter conditions. The first few of the ship were servants of Edward Bennett, okay? The wealthy London merchant, Sephardic Jew Bennett Baruch, all right? That had paid for over 800 servants to travel to the New World. He paid Europeans, not Africans, 800 of them, so they can travel to the New World to work on his plantations, and who had already established his plantation, so they had a place to stay. All right, a lot of them were his friends, a lot of them might be his family. All right, hey, come over, I got a plantation, I got a job for you. You work for me for 7 years, you get your freedom. I can help you do it. All right, passengers, down here says Antonio, a Negro servant to Edward Bennett. Antonio, all right? All right, so before we go here, we got, I actually tried to build the tree for Anthony Johnson. You know, I'm starting way back. It's not as easy, you know, when you're all the way here in 1600s, but a historic person like this and this family of the Johnsons, you know, do have some kind of records, and people, you know, have tried to build these trees, because I did get a couple of hints. I just want to show you guys what I did find here real quick. So we're going to Antonio Edmund Johnson. All right, and I know I got this shield here showing the Johnson, a family crest is saying he was born in Lincolnshire, England. Remember, he was coming from England, so most likely he could have been born there, right? Like we know they moved to Maryland, right, in the later years. We read that. All right, just want to show you what other family members had for Anthony Johnson, and just so you can see, I'm not the one just making this up. So this family had Anthony Edmund Johnson, immigrant, right? They had the Edmund too. And of course they put Angola, Portuguese possessed Africa. This could be straight up Portugal right away, you know, but we know he's coming from England, so that's conjecture. When you go into these people's trees, right? Let me show you. So this is this person's tree. They have no proof that he was born in Africa. In fact, they have signed about arriving in Maryland, Anthony Johnson, immigrant. In fact, it just says he arrived in Maryland in 1665 here. It doesn't say from where. All right. So what sources does this lady have to say that this person was born in Africa, other than the narratives that they give us, the same ones from always, right? Everybody's from Angola. All right. So another family has Anthony, one of the first to be enslaved in Virginia colony in 1621. He was never a slave, right? He was an indentured servant. Now they're putting on the James. So remember, the James was coming from England, so they did have that right. And enslaved by Edward Bennett Johnson, who married Marie, freed by 1640. So they put the whole history in the name right here, right? And of course they put Angola, even though they did say he's coming on the James. Now they put Edward Bennett as the father. You see that? So they don't know really much what they're saying. They just a lot of this is, you know, you got to take with a grain of salt. But there was some interesting information here, you know, as I was going along. Like this one right here, it listed Juan de Angola Johnson as the father and Mary de Soyo. If you switch the Y for the T, you get De Soto, right? De Soto, Mary De Soto, Juan Johnson or John Johnson, and of course they add the Angola. And of course, when you go to these people trees, they don't have no sources to prove that him or his parents are coming out of, you know, Angola or Africa. The records, as you can see here, Anthony Johnson, Northampton County, Virginia pioneer, 1651. Where does that have to do with anything in Africa? And then we got the immigrant going into Maryland, same record, right? And then again, other family trees. They don't have no sources for these people being, but where did they get these names from is the interesting part. So we keep going, and then we got Anthony Edmund Johnson. This person hasn't been born in Lincolnshire, England, which makes more sense, him coming out of England. Okay, and they got James Johnson and Elizabeth Travis. I didn't see no records for that. This family also had Juan de Angola Johnson and Mary de Soyo, Edmund Johnson, but everybody seems to know that he had a middle name or something like that called Edmund. He was referred to as Anthony and Antonio, and these people got Juan or John, Mary de Soyo. Now in the gallery for Anthony Johnson, we got all the stories that we've of course heard and read already. Anthony Johnson was the first prominent black landholder in the English colonies, and you know, we got all these stories attached. So I know I'm in the right person. Of course, they got a drawing. We don't know if that's it. We got some images like this. The first American to own slaves was a black man. All right, so this is on Ancestry. We already went over the information. For his wife, Mary, I did get a lot of hints talking about a specific Mary Pendleton and Heath, Mary Pendleton and Heath. The Mary Johnson's wills, we got wills attached here with her stuff. It says here John Casor, first American slave. None of this stuff in these wills or anything like that, it says that she's from Africa. And when you go into different trees for her, you can see that Mary Johnson, they try to put West Africa. Again, she was coming from England. We know that on the Margaret and Johnson ship. And you see Anthony Johnson right here. They have Mary Jane Pendleton. So I'm still researching, making sure. It's hard to find any info. I'm gonna just leave it here for now. We know that they were coming from England though, so it makes sense that they, like this family, would put that she was born in Buckinghamshire, England, and died in Accomack County, Virginia. They have her parents as Edward Pendleton and Marjorie Thomas, and it keeps going. But a lot of people, you know, also listen her as Heath. You know, I'm verifying all that. But it's here and there, bits and parts. As you go further down in the line, it does get a little more historic. We have all these people listed in the wills and all the websites we read, like the Free African American, Mija was reading, to confirm that these are the kids. You can go into these kids and you can see different records attached to them and facts, like Richard Johnson. As you can see, they attached the Free African American information that they have here, where they list Richard. As you can see here, Richard Johnson, born about 1632, was one of the 5 persons his father claimed head, right? His father, which they're talking about, Anthony Johnson. All right, again, this is historic stuff here. This is historic stuff. Okay, and we got John Johnson, his son, and Joanne. It says John Johnson married Lady Ducombe's boy. I'm still verifying that. She got 11 hints here I got to go through. All right, but I want you to pay attention to their child, another Joanne, right? Joanne Johnson. I'm going to show you guys who she is and who she married. So again, remember, this is Anthony Johnson's granddaughter. So these are all colored people, right? So-called Negro people. Joanne Johnson from 1660. Her husband is John Puckham, right? Or Puckahum from the Natticoke tribe, supposedly. We're going to read a little bit about that right now. It says here, Puckham family. John Puckham, born, say, 1660, was an Indian who married Anthony Johnson's granddaughter, Joanne Johnson. And that came up when I was doing the tree. All those hints, all this stuff was attaching. And Stepney Parish, Somerset County, Maryland. John Puckham, an Indian baptized by John Hewitt, minister, on the 25th day of January, 1608, to and the said John Puckham and Joan Johnson, Negro, were married by the said minister, G. 25th of February. All right, so that was when they got married. It says Clayton Torrance surmised that John may have been from the Moni Indian town, which was not far from the home of Joanne Johnson's likely father, John Johnson of Wicomico Creek. All right, that's the one we just saw, which is Anthony Johnson's son. And again, that's her father, so she's his granddaughter, remember? And Thomas Davison suggested that the name Puckham may have been derived from the Nanticoke Indian village Pukami. All right, so he might be from that village who are Nanticoke Indians, which then existed in northern Somerset County. John Puckham may have been deceased on the 13th of June, 1699, when Joanne Puckham bound her sons, John and Richard, as apprentices in Somerset County Court. You see, they were bounding their own kids. That was normal, just like Abraham Lincoln by his dad, Benjamin Franklin by his dad, William Ellison, one of the first black major black slave owners, right? South Carolina. William Ellison, remember? He wasn't a slave. He was apprenticed by his own dad to learn a trade, the gin business, right? All right, so back in the tree, we don't really got like much on John Puckham. I was trying to do more research. I'm going to go ahead and definitely do more digging, see what I can find. They just listed his parents as Nanticoke Indian of Moni, Pocahom Village, and Sarah Nanticoke woman. That's his parents. How she get Sarah? Again, the Hebrew name. Now it says in this article here, Moni Indian Town, aka Manny or Moni Indian Town. The records of Maryland and Somerset Cove fail to identify the native people living on the Great Many River and Creek. The village is mentioned in the patent granted to Nehemiah Covington in 1665 for 300 acres called Covington's Vineyard. It says, it is possible that the native people living on the Great Moni were part of the Manokin subtribe or band of the Pocomoke Paramountcy. The area is only 5 miles northwest of the town, located on the Trading Branch and the Manokin River. It is interesting to know that a small community about 3 miles south of the location of Manny Indian Town on Mount Road 363 is today called Moni. All right, so they might be actually Pocomoke Paramountcy and not Nanticoke, but if they are, as the Pocomoke Nation and Eastern Woodland culture of the Algonquin language group is historically identified as the first people of the rivers of Pocomoke, Anemessex, and Manoking, and the Bay of Chincoteague. The Pocomokes were likely engaged by Europeans prior to Captain John Smith's 1608 exploration. It says down here, the territory of the Pocomoke took in what is now Somerset, all right, Maryland, and Worcester counties of Maryland, and extended into northern Accomack County, Virginia. Towns and villages took the name of adjacent rivers, creeks, and bays, or vice versa. Pocomoke lands were greatly consumed by the encroachment of European settlements, Johnsons, during the 17th and early 18th century. Except for surviving villages at river necks, the Pocomoke were driven onto reservations, including Asquiminiconsin near Snow Hill, Maryland. It is through intermarriage of Europeans and Pocomoke people of the villages in these necks that the mantle of leadership has been perpetuated and survives. All right. The intermarriage of Europeans and the Pocomoke people. Yeah, so that's literally what really happened everywhere. But hope you guys enjoyed the revisit here to Anthony Johnson, especially to all my new followers, all my new subscribers, anybody who's missed the older research we have on Anthony Johnson and the story behind him. Officially, the first chattel slave owner, chattel, to own somebody for life, perpetually. Because before that, it didn't exist. It was just indentured servitude. And really, that's what really it was from the whole time. A lot of the chattel people that got put in chattel was because their indentures were being abused. You know what I mean? Or, they just weren't following up on it. So, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I appreciate you guys who were here for the live chat. Thank you. Or who saw this video later. Thank you for making the time all the way to the end right here. Hope you guys enjoyed it. You guys see the history they teach us is really not the same. They want us to picture something else when we were growing up in school, learning all this history and slavery and all that. They never told us about Anthony Johnson. You know what I mean? So I just wanted you guys to be aware of this stuff. It's not because A lot of people, they take this personal and not understanding, but I just invite you to catch up on the last 8 years of research, get all the context, especially if you have questions, especially if you come in with questions, because a lot of you say you just question, you just asking me a question, but you're just questioning me in a debating form. You don't really care for the answers. The answers are all in my presentations, so make sure to take advantage of that. All right. The answers that you seek, that you want to ask me, about, debate, talk about, then the last 8 years of research. The research speaks for itself. Okay. And as you guys can see over the years, this makes a lot more sense now. When we were first learning about Anthony Johnson years ago, it was like, wow, like a black slave owner way back in 1600s. Wait, what do you mean a slave went to court and sued for his freedom? What do you mean slaves could do that? We didn't have no context. We didn't understand. But now we have a lot of understanding, a lot of context. And this to us is normal now. This is what's common. This was just one case that sticks out of many that there actually is. All right. So thank you for being here. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure to like and share, subscribe if you haven't. Want to support what I do, I got the Patreon page or my channel membership. I'm kind of constantly uploading new books there on my Patreon and stuff. All right. So thank you for all the support, guys. Appreciate you guys being here today. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. We're gonna go out with a beat from Olmec 12. Shout out to Olmec 12. It's called Con Mayo. Con Mayo. Hawaii.